but you're in the right place. I'm going to mute myself for just another minute or two, and then we're going to get going. So thank you again for being here, and we'll get started very shortly. All right, in the interest of time, we'll get started because I know it's Friday afternoon and I want to make sure that we make the best use of everyone's time. Good morning or good afternoon to you, depending on where you're joining us from. We hope everyone is safe and healthy at the end of what has really been a very difficult and emotional week here in the United States. We're very pleased that you chose to close out your week with us for our webinar today, EVs for Grid Energy Storage. Two of my colleagues at Pecan Street are going to be reviewing some of our most recent research on EVs, specifically vehicle to grid technology, and discussing how the technology in the industry is moving forward. But before we get to today's topic, I do have a couple of housekeeping items. First, I'd like to make everyone aware of a webinar that we're going to be hosting in July. It's Tuesday, July 14th at 10 a.m. Central about clean energy in Texas. For those of you who are in Texas, it might not surprise you that we are a clean energy leader. For those of you outside of Texas, you might be a little bit of surprised to know just how much of a leader Texas is. We've assembled a really good panel that's going to discuss how Texas became a leader in clean energy, how the state can continue to lead in the future, and how other states can follow our lead and learn from our experience. We're going to hear from Kirk Watson, who is the former state senator here in Texas and the new dean of the University of Houston Hobby School of Public Affairs. Pat Wood, former chair of both the Public Utility Commission of Texas and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Jim Marston, VP of Public Affairs at Environmental Defense Fund, and Dr. Michael Weber of ENGIE. He's an accomplished author and he's a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. So the registration link is there on your screen. If you were invited to this webinar, you will be invited to that webinar. If you didn't get an invitation directly from Pecan Street, we're going to share some contact information with you in just a minute. So you'll be able to get on our list and make sure that you get an invitation directly from us. For today's webinar, you're going to hear from a couple of staff here at Pecan Street. I'm Colin Rowan. I'm here simply to introduce things and keep things going. Andrea Tosi, who is the power, she's going to present our V2G research. Scott Hinson, who you might have seen at our last webinar, is our Chief Technology Officer, and he's going to discuss kind of the state of the industry and where things are going. And you're going to also hear from Clayton Johnson, who's running our slides, and he's going to be handling some of our Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question throughout the webinar, please use the chat function. We've done this previously in the past. We have several people who are going to be monitoring the chat window. So please, if you have a question for any of our speakers, please use that. If it's appropriate, we'll interrupt a slide to ask a question, and then we also have an opportunity after each speaker to address some specific Q&A. If you'd like a copy of our recent case study about the research Andrea is going to review, you can scan this QR code that is about to pop up on your screen, or you can visit the last URL on this slide. It'll pull up a PDF that you can download. If you want to reach either of the speakers, please do so via their email address. And finally, again, if you want to make sure you're on our list, please use the media@pecanstreet.org email address. So as we begin, I want to briefly explain how EVs fit into Pecan Street's research. We have three core capabilities: our field research, our database, and our lab. And EVs Our EV research is part of all three of them. Many of our volunteer participants have EVs and rooftop solar. And because we monitor energy use at the circuit level every second of every day, it allows us to see things like charging times, charging patterns, whether charging is aligning with solar generation, peak demand, et cetera, et cetera. Like almost all of the data we collect, our EV charging data or our EV use data is available on our Dataport website through academic and corporate licenses. So people can do their own analysis and they don't have to count on just our case studies and our reports. And finally, our lab, which is at the heart of what Andrea is going to be speaking about today, allows us to test and verify new technology that's not yet on the market to kind of verify its efficiency, its efficacy, and its reliability. All this to say that EVs are not at the core of one part of our work, but they really are at the core of all of the work that we do, whether it's in the field, through our data, or at the lab. With that introduction, I'm going to pass the microphone to Andrea Tosi. She's the Power Systems Specialist at Pecan Street. As we switch to her, I'm going to remind everyone to please use the chat function if you have a question. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can. And I will say this because Andrea might not. Proof that we are doing research right in the heart of a real neighborhood. Andrea was saying that the trash has not yet been picked up on its Friday route, so we might be interrupted by a trash service. And the people in the house right behind the Nissan Leaf that you see are moving in today. So she's going to give her presentation, and then she might go dark because we don't necessarily need to show strangers on our webinar. So with that introduction, Andrea, please take it away, and it is all yours.
Yes, thank you, Colin, and thank you everybody for being here. Before I dive into the vehicle to grid presentation, I want to give a quick background on the Austin Shines project, which is really the umbrella for which the vehicle to grid program came in place. So Austin Shines is a DOE funded project done by Austin Energy, Doosan Grid Tech, and Pecan Street. SHINES stands for the Sustainable and Holistic Integration of Energy Storage and Solar PV, which is really another one of those wonderful DOE acronyms that you all might be familiar with. So the project's main goal is to install energy storage in places where PV adoption is already pretty prevalent. As the residential aggregator, we installed 7 stationary batteries in the Mueller neighborhood. And the Nissan Leaf, which you see right behind me, is the vehicle to grid, which added another 10 kW capacity to our fleet. And so this infographic kind of gives you a quick overview of what the Austin Shines program was. So over everything, you have the DER management platform system, which is the DER optimizer, the DERO, which takes in ERCOT market signals and weather forecasting signals to really make decisions on whether these assets that are installed in the utility, commercial, and residential field can, and I think the trash is coming right now. And so, apologies. So the DERO is going to oversee all of these different assets based on those signals that it is receiving. Us as the residential aggregator, we're going to be passing on those signals to the different energy storage, whether it's stationary or the vehicle. And I'm going to pause just until, if that's okay.
We should have paid the extra Zoom fee to have some hold music for everybody. But this will be a brief pause. Thanks everyone for bearing with us. This is, it's like live, as Scott said beforehand, welcome to the world of live TV. And here we are, and we're doing it in the middle of a real American neighborhood. So.
Andrea, you're still muted.
Sorry. Okay, we're good. So, so we added the vehicle as the 8th battery, but we recognize that the vehicle is not going to be like the stationary battery. So we need to take into account a couple of things. So one is that the vehicle is not always going to be available to charge or discharge. And then additionally, that the person who owns the vehicle might not necessarily want to be part of the program. So we wanted to give the customer the option to opt in or opt out of the program. Additionally, we don't want to drain the batteries of the vehicle all the way to 0 like the stationary batteries are, because we want to give the customer about 40 miles of driving range in any case. And so we incorporated that into our own aggregator. So you'll see some slides in the next few slides. You'll see some graphs where you see 0 state of charge, but that's really that the vehicle is at 20% state of charge, and that's what we respond to 0 so that the car is not available. So we incorporated all those caveats in the aggregator that the other batteries didn't have, but the vehicle had to have. So what really is vehicle to grid? So as you see here on the screen, you have the solid lines of power flow. So for a charge event, you have AC power going from the grid in the Princeton power systems, which is the black box you see right behind me. That AC power gets converted into DC power to charge the high voltage battery in the Nissan Leaf. Vice versa, you are able to take DC power as you follow the gray lines to the V2G unit, which converts it back to AC and takes it back to the grid. I will show you a video in the next few slides that is kind of representing the lab load and the vehicle as it's charging and discharging. So it's really more of a vehicle to home instead of a vehicle to grid, because we are meeting that load of the home. But it could be that the loads home is less than what the vehicle could provide, and that is truly when the vehicle to grid example is happening. The communication you see with the dotted arrows, one a little bit, yep. And so Austin Energy through Dero is sending us commands to charge or discharge the battery to the aggregator, and then based on the availability of the vehicle, we pass on to the Princeton charger to either charge or discharge. All right, next slide. Okay, so a fun anecdote we had, which is the reason for this communication flow chart. After we finished the software and we had everything working, it was I think it was a Friday, and we left it on. We left the car connected to the aggregator, and it was, you know, it was working. And then Monday morning, we came back to a completely dead vehicle. So what happened? Really, it's what happens when we queue every single asset every 10 seconds. So because we wanted to make sure to see what the state of the car was, we were queuing it every 10 seconds, and the car and the charger didn't have enough time to actually continue that switching. 10 seconds wasn't enough. So we were basically cycling the 12-volt battery that controls all the electronics multiple times without it letting complete its cycle, and that drained the 12-volt battery, even though the high voltage battery was completely full. So we had to somewhat, not dumb down, but really it wasn't as smart. The charger wasn't as smart as we thought. So what we needed to include in the aggregator was this kind of flow chart. So really what you see here is our design process. So we looked at, is the charger, the Princeton CA charger, charging or discharging the vehicle? If it is, we can queue the vehicle directly because we know those communication switches have closed. If it's not, then we check this bypass switch, which we enabled for the customer. If the bypass switch is enabled, we know that the vehicle is not there and it's not available for charging or discharging. So we just tell Dero the car is not available, power, you can't charge or discharge, and so we send a power of 0 to the aggregator. If the bypass switch is not enabled, then we know that the car is present. And so what happens then, we want to make sure that the last time it was present or it wasn't, to know if the car has been idling or not. If it has changed, the bypass switch state has changed, then we can cue the car to get that new, the new state of charge. So this is really, for example, the car leaves because the customer needs to go to the grocery store. It says, I'm not available for the aggregator, but when it comes back, I am available. So there's a state of the bypass switch that changes. And so we have to cue the car, and we basically send a quick charge command to get all those registers updated on the Princeton charger. But if it hasn't changed, then we know the car is simply standing on idle like it is right now. And we then, instead of going through this 10-second cycle constantly that drains the battery, we just simply look at a text file that has the latest updated registers for that aggregator. So this was something, it was a very interesting find that we did, and we recognized that not all chargers are smart, I guess to say, and so the smarts needs to really come from the aggregator, which is us in this case. Next slide. All right, and so here I'm going to show you a little video. Oh, it's already playing, sorry. What you see here is that that's switching happening. So the charger is queuing the car to make sure that it's connected. As soon as it connects, I send it a 10 kW discharge. Green is going to be a discharge, which you see on the right-hand side of your screen. Then I quickly send a 5 kW discharge. So that happens immediately, as you can see. And then I send a 10 kW charge, which goes to red. And so you can see that this happening between charge and discharge cycles is immediate, which is really important for any asset to become part of ancillary services for the utility. You want to have assets that can respond this quickly. So this was really positive for us. And then I'm soon going to show you, yeah, so this is what I was talking earlier. So you see the load profile for our lab. We're not at home, so our load is pretty high, but you can see how those, if you, Colin, if you can go ahead and go back to where I show the load and pause it for a little bit. Yeah, that's about right. Yep, so you can see that first step is when we're discharging the car. So you can see that the load for the lab is really only that red chunk between that red line and the top green line. And so that is really how the car is meeting the lab's load. Then we go down to 5 kW, the load is a little bit bigger, but we're still meeting it. Of course, when we're charging the vehicle, we're gonna have a much greater load, so that's also impacted by this, and you can see it on the graph. And just like we send charge and discharge cycles, we also, and you can go ahead and play it, Clayton. We're also able to send stop commands. So the DRO, you know, whenever they don't send any commands, then we idle it and leave it idle. And so I did that here in the last few seconds of this video. All right, next. So like I was saying, we did realize once we saw that this vehicle to grid project works, then we went, you know, and connected it to the aggregator, and it's been connected since July. So we were able to study the vehicle and the different commands that DRO sends through the summer and the winter months. The table you see here is the 6 different applications that the Austin Shines team prioritized. And even though there is you might be able to see this online, there's a different table that shows all the different assets from utility, commercial, and residential. I decided to just look at the vehicle to grid. And so for the vehicle, it can provide utility peak load reduction during the summer months through the ERCOT 4CP program. For those of you not familiar with the ERCOT 4CP program, it is really a way for transmission to be reduced, the cost of transmission to be reduced for the following year. So if utilities can decrease the load this summer, that means that their transmission costs next summer are going to, or next year, are going to be less. And so if we use behind the meter assets like the vehicle, we are able to reduce that peak load from the utility during the 4CP events, which are in June, July, August, and September. Likewise, for winter months and the rest of the year, really, we saw the benefit and the value of vehicle to grid happening really with the real-time price dispatch. So what does that mean? Basically, we're looking at what the cost of energy is, and we charge and discharge based on those costs. Next slide, please. And so here you see an example of the 4CP value. So this was for September, and the 4CP event happened on September 6th from 4:30 to 4:45. And you see that during this time, the state of charge of the vehicle is being reduced. Therefore, this asset is being discharged, and we're maximizing that value during those 15 minutes. However, you do see here in the 16:35 to 16:40, 4:35 and 4:40, the car is actually charging. And so something must have happened that DERA wanted to make sure we had enough power to continue discharging the asset throughout. So maybe they just charged it a little bit for 5 minutes and then started discharging again. I think the moving truck just came in. So I'm gonna go through the next slide pretty quickly, which is gonna show you how the winter months really happen. And next slide, yep. So here we see the example of any day in the winter where the car is staying at about 40 to 60% state of charge throughout the day. Then it really reduces or starts discharging during the peak time, which is between 6 and 9 p.m. here in Austin. And then as soon as that cost of energy starts going down, we start recognizing that and we start charging the vehicle. And so this is the value recognized for both the utility and the customer in this case. And of course, we recognize we are in Texas in the ERCOT region where the cost of energy in itself is already a little bit less than the rest of the nation. But this is extremely valuable still in Texas, but also in California or in Hawaii where the cost of energy is much higher. So with that, I think we might be doing questions if you have any. And with that, I say thank you.
Great, thanks, Andrea. This is Clayton, everyone. One question that came up, Andrea, is if you know anything about vehicle manufacturers and if a vehicle participating in a vehicle to grid program would have any effect on the manufacturer's warranty on the battery or the car itself?
Yes, I would say that is the most popular question that we get. At the moment in the US, Nissan is the only manufacturer allowing vehicle to grid. Like our webinar actually says, I think at the topic or a few blog posts we have, we are the only place in Texas that does vehicle to grid or that has a charger, a bidirectional charger like the one we have in the back. So there probably is an impact to the warranty. Nissan does not see it as such, so it allows for vehicle to grid to happen in the US. However, BMW, Tesla, any of the other electric vehicle manufacturers do not allow for it, most likely because of warranty, yes.
One quick thing to add to Andrea's comment, and we didn't go over this slide, but it is in the assessment for if people want to download it, is that we didn't notice a significant degradation of battery life throughout the course of this. And so that's, that clearly that's only one part of why a manufacturer would be concerned about a warranty. One of the other things, and we don't know this for sure, but this is such a new thing, and there's EVs in general are new to the market. And it might just be that the manufacturers haven't gotten there yet to thinking about what would V2G mean and what would it mean to their warranty. And so I don't think we don't know as an organization what their thinking is, what their concerns are, what their worries are. We just know that Nissan, when we needed to get a car for part of the study, we were getting Nissan Leaf because it was going to be okay for the warranty.
And one thing to notice too that maybe is worth noticing here is that the economies of scale really for infrastructure and bidirectional power infrastructure is not there yet. The Nissan Leaf you see in the back was about $30,000. The charger itself is $32,000. So the economies of scale really aren't there. So someone who's buying a Nissan Leaf is also, if they're interested in doing vehicle to grid, is also going to have to buy basically a second car, the price of a second car, to be able to get this type of device. So as a research organization, we recognize that, of course, this is up and coming. The economies of scale are not there, and the warranty conversation would definitely need to happen with the manufacturers before this becomes a reality.
Great. We've got a couple more questions coming in. So next question, does the system require additional modifications to be installed in the car, or does this work, quote unquote, out of the box with existing vehicles?
Yeah, absolutely no changes to the car. The car is how it came. What we did was, and no changes to the charging infrastructure either. So basically, it's all in the code that we created as an aggregator. There are absolutely no changes that we did to the hardware of the car or the charger.
Good. And then are there any issues with heat dissipation with the discharge? Are you discharging slow enough not to overheat the battery?
So we don't have a way to look at internal temperature of the battery. That would probably require us to do some hardware. So what I can talk to is to being in the garage while the car is charging or discharging. I have never noticed it becoming extremely hot. That's probably because we have the AC on at all times. But
also, I'll add in, our discharge rate is significantly lower than acceleration discharge rates for those batteries. And so for vehicle to grid purposes, our charge and discharge rate, even though that's classified as a fairly high speed charger, it's still pretty slow for that size battery.
Right. The maximum charge is 10 kW and the minimum, or the discharge is 10 kW. So yes.
Great. And then a regulatory question for you. Are there any regulatory issues that need to be addressed in order to enable large-scale adoption of V2G in Texas?
I don't think I know the answer to that. Scott,
Yeah.
would you like to pitch in on this, or?
Boy, the regulatory question is so large that would have to basically be a webinar in and of itself. So we'll take that down as an action item. Because if I start now, we're not getting through any of the other slides and there's no other questions. I'm sorry.
I will say Austin Energy, who is our utility here, has always been a friend of the, what do you call it? Friend of the industry or whatnot, but they you know, the vehicle team there, the electric vehicle team at Austin Energy was super excited about these encounters. And of course, they really pushed to make sure that vehicle to grid was part of the Austin Shines, which is a project that they were funded. So, you know, seems like the utility's on board. I'm not going to speak for them because obviously we're not the utility, but maybe we'll get there soon.
Great. So a few more questions. Will vehicle to grid technology require a higher ratio of EVs to public charging points to ensure an acceptable number of vehicles connected to the grid at any given moment?
I speak personally in this, and I would say yes, to maximize the value of 4CP, like I mentioned, or real-time price dispatch, or anything. I would say that yes, ideally, you know, and if we go back to normal without COVID times where people are mainly charging in their workplace, then I would say yes, that integration is maybe not required, but definitely would be faster.
Great. And then I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to try and combine into one. Can you speak to the process for, you know, what happens if a vehicle is connected to the grid during a power outage? Is there an automatic shutoff, or can vehicles in these circumstances ever be used as battery backup?
So for Andrea, you want to go, or you
No,
got
go
some
ahead,
background noise? Okay. So for this particular charger, and this is sort of stealing the thunder from part of the section that I was going to talk on, but I'll go ahead and do it. For this particular charger, this is there's a couple different classes of inverters. There is grid forming or grid interactive, and this is a grid interactive inverter. In other words, it can't generate a grid on its own. It has to have the bulk utility grid present in order to function. A grid forming inverter is one that's capable of generating power so that the house can be run off that inverter alone and does not need the bulk grid or whatever load. So you see these, like the coolers at Costco and Sam's and stuff like that. Those are grid forming inverters that they're tiny, right? But they can generate power and power load by themselves. Grid interactive inverters are like the inverters for the vast majority of solar systems installed in the United States right now, where if the power goes out, that inverter stops operating.
Great. Great. And we have some other questions that I think we can get to at the end, but that's a great segue to Scott's portion of the presentation. So with that, I'll
yeah, it just got 90 seconds faster.
Yeah. With that, I'll introduce our CTO, Scott Hinson.
Hello, everyone. So I'm talking about sort of some of the implications that we've talked about. A lot of these questions are sort of dancing around it, where we are talking about what would happen if you had a bunch of vehicles. There was a recent news article, an announcement in questions. I guess we can go to the next slide. I think that's the image that we've got, right? Tesla, quote unquote, announces V2G. There were some enterprising folks who on the out there who have basically been doing teardowns of all sorts of electric vehicles, and they got to Tesla chargers, and they took one of them apart, and about 3 weeks ago or so, they announced that they were bidirectional capable. Tesla did not officially announce this. It's part of the quotation marks. Let's go to the next slide. So there's a lot of implications for that. To understand truly what that announcement meant, what I did is I took apart one of our standard level 2 EVSEs, electric vehicle support equipment, otherwise known as a car charger. Okay, so to understand what that meant and what's in the car versus what's on your wall is important for this discussion. What's on your wall right now for electric vehicle chargers is fairly simple equipment. There's a little bit of communication circuitry. I have an arrow pointed to it. It's kind of hidden by the bezel of the frame plate. There's some safety, some very critical safety detection circuitry that makes sure that you can't drive away with the charge cord enabled. That means if there's some sort of electrical short where you might be able to get a shock, if there's some leakage current, it won't close the contactors, those kinds of things. And that's about it. There's some safety fuses in case something really goes wrong, and there is a short circuit. They'll pop instead of causing a fire. And then there's a relay. Okay, so there's nothing fancy. The electric vehicle support equipment that you put on the wall is basically a switch. All right, it's a switch with a little bit of intelligence to say, is the car present? Is it ready to charge? What's the maximum charge rate? And then close that contactor. But that's all it is. Next slide. So with the teardown of the Tesla hardware, what they announced was that there has been sort of this shift in the landscape of electric vehicles. It turned out they were incorrect. Okay. So you've got some options. The first is what we've got right now, which is you've got some sort of wall outlet or direct connection to a circuit breaker at 120 or 240 volt AC. There's the EVSE that I showed that I took apart, took a photo of, and then that goes to the car. And notice I put that little MOSFET semiconductor circuit symbol on that car. That shows that the electronics, the smarts and the electronics to convert DC to AC, or AC to DC, sorry, AC to DC are in that car. They're not on the wall. The fancy stuff is in the car, okay? What we installed at the lab is the next step down, okay? In this case, there's an AC connection to the charger. There's a lot of very fancy electronics. As Andrea mentioned, $32,000 worth of fancy electronics in that bidirectional charger that can convert AC to DC or DC to AC. But that means that the connection to the car has to be DC, okay? And basically, they're giving us direct connection to the batteries of the car themselves, okay? So you're not, and this requires special equipment, right? There's been some announcements of companies. Some folks are saying that they're getting the target price for some of this stuff down to $4,000, but a lot of these are startups, and you know, in 2 years, which one wins and which one has market share, I don't know. That's the part we're gonna have to wait and see and watch for. What was theorized was happening was that there was vehicle to grid based, or there's vehicle-based vehicle to grid electronics. So that would be the bottom example that I have here. So what that means is you could use that same EVSE that we showed first, that simple, inexpensive, cheap one that's basically a smart switch that says, okay, is it safe to charge or now discharge, close the contactors, and then the vehicle has the electronics that are in the blue box embedded with it, okay? So that means those electronics go wherever that vehicle goes, all right? And that's a big difference. So next slide. There are some pros to this, right? There are some obvious pros. When the news articles were going around in the sort of the trade internet publications for this, that means that there was this, the pros would be that all of a sudden there was this existing fleet of electric vehicles with existing EVSEs that could be used for vehicle to grid applications, okay? You now have a mobile grid resource, okay? If you needed to, you could put the call out in a disaster scenario and get a whole bunch of energy generation capability to move from one spot to another. And then there's the obvious pro for this of lower costs through material and sort of redundancy reduction, right? The Nissan Leaf that we have in the garage has an AC connector and a DC connector. So it does have electronics in it, and it has the DC connector. Well, if you can start to minimize all of these sort of double connectors and electronics here and there, all of a sudden the whole system gets lower cost, right? Then we started to think about the drawbacks to this. There's some locational guarantee issues, right? Like if for some reason you call for a discharge from a vehicle and that vehicle is not where you thought it was, that means you might be discharging power back into the grid in the wrong spot. There's some building side safety implications. For a device this size, it's supposed to be run off a single circuit. It's supposed to be the only thing on that circuit. But we all know that you know, as buildings age, things sort of diverge from that pure NEC implementation of installations. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into residential and even small commercial properties where it's like, that wasn't originally installed this way, and now we have an issue potentially with a vehicle that can generate power and a power source coming from the grid, that we have, if we have a load elsewhere, that we've got two sources of energy and now we don't have proper fusing in that circuit. So there's some safety implications there. And there's also some cybersecurity implications as well, because these vehicles now represent a potential threat vector. I've done some work with LL&L, a very small amount of work, and they're very concerned about being able to ensure that resources are there when you need them and not there when you don't want them. And this does have some implications, okay? There's also some complications in terms of inverter type, right? If the vehicle is now driving around with this extra electronics, how often does it get used? Does that mean that, that there is a cost to the vehicle that is over and above for maybe a vehicle that doesn't ever get hooked up and used that way. We see that there's some benefit for market structures, especially where there's strong time of use pricing, or there's like Texas for the 4CP type events. If there's a strong pricing signal, these sorts of things will probably pay for themselves pretty quick. But if there's not, then you've got this vehicle and you have to decide, do I make two versions, one for the marketplace that may or may not be able to pay for this, or do I just standardize on one and make everybody pay a little extra? So yeah, that is sort of the overview that we had. When we first saw those articles, it was like, this is really cool. Then the more I thought about it, I was like, ooh, I wonder if they thought about this. Then I thought, you know, these other things. And then all of a sudden I'm starting to do more research, and there's actually a great video, and I think I understand what originally happened. There's a great video where somebody is showing the teardown of that inverter, and the parts look physically the same, but on one side they're one type and on one side they're the other. And that means they can't function to take that energy backwards out of that battery. So even though they looked physically the same, inside that package, they were different.
Hey, Scott and Andrea, if I can just ask you, this is purely speculative, but you know, for a week or two, there seemed to be quite a bit of not just excitement in the market, but we were kind of intrigued by the possibility of this. Where would you guys predict it's going to go when it comes to where's the intelligence, where are the electronics going to go? Let's just look 10 years down the road on V2G, and let's just presume the cost issue, Andrea, that you were talking about has been taken care of. Where's the box going to be? Is it going to be on the wall? Is it going to be in the car?
I think you're going to see it eventually I think you're going to see it in the car, but I also think there's going to be a smart thing on the wall as well, because you need to have some sort of confirmation of where that car is, right? And a GPS signal from a vehicle telematics is not enough. I mean, how many times have we gone into a parking garage or a city street where there's lots of tall buildings and we hear GPS signal loss? We're like, no, I need to know where to turn, right? Right? So my guess is that based on the criticality of the application, that there's going to be some sort of two levels of technology authenticating where that vehicle is and what that vehicle capability is. So yeah. I would hope that it goes in, eventually I honestly hope that it goes in the car. It looks like they physically have space on that Tesla board that I saw, the videos of where they took. It looks like they have space to make the electronics do that. They just didn't.
And I will add that, you know, for the stationary batteries, there are inverters which go into the wall. They're, you know, that you can install in your garage without any issue. We installed 7 of them. And so there is capability of making something that would be small, that would, you know, be able to fit in a garage, in a home. So I think that's going to be kind of the next step before we get into what Scott was talking about.
Got it.
So do we have questions that we should be answering?
I know Clayton's marshaling those. I'll just ask one quick one that started that came in, Scott, right when you were talking about grid forming versus grid interactive. He was commenting on the Tesla Gigawall is grid forming, and he says about $1,000. Can you is that an example of what an inverter might cost at scale?
Yeah, I mean, there's examples. We've had LG electronics inverters that are grid forming capable, Solar Edge, Schneider, they all make, SMA makes one. We haven't tested that one, but we have tested the first 3 that I mentioned. So we've looked at a bunch of different grid forming inverters, and grid forming inverters can also be grid interactive inverters. That the LG one specifically that I mentioned, it can take DC or AC input energy and then if there's a power outage, it can take energy out of the batteries and keep whatever backup circuits that you have attached to it going, just like the Tesla solution as well.
Got it.
Great, great. So another question that came in. So we already mentioned that we didn't find any significant battery degradation, but someone's asking that essentially the number of charge cycles per week would be what would potentially affect battery lifetime.
Right.
So how many how many added charge cycles per week are we talking about?
I'd have to go back and look at the data. I mean, I know I saw some weeks where we had at least an extra charge cycle a day, right?
Yeah, and I will say we're not using the car nearly as much as transportation as most people would. So we're not giving that, that degradation piece. We've tried to drive it as much as we can, but the reality is that we'll take it out maybe twice a week, Scott, would you agree? And then on that, it's just sitting in the garage waiting for charges. So it's as close to reality as we could have gotten it, but of course we're here in the lab during work hours. We're not taking it out like, most people might, so.
This is one of those areas where researchers say more study is needed.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, there is the progress that's been made in battery lifetime, even in the last 10 years, has been pretty good, right? And the number of manufacturers that are even willing to sort of talk about it. Like when we bought the car for the program, we had to read the warranties for a bunch of the vehicles very carefully, because some of them were pretty explicit. If you use the vehicle for vehicle to grid, not only does that the moment the warranty ends, but the vehicle warranty ends, right? I mean, like they were pretty draconian. And others were like, yeah, we'd really rather you not do that. And they weren't so draconian about it. So Nissan was the only one that was like, yeah, you can do that.
Great. So another question, do you think level 1 and level 2 technologies are good options for V2G, since their power limit is limited and they may not provide enough power in the short term to support the grid?
This actually goes to a concept that we've been looking at for a long time, with sort of a distributed hierarchical approach. And that's a really fancy way of saying, yes, I think it's useful. We think that, if you're looking at avoiding grid upgrades for, constraint purposes and things like that, that if you can get generation, even if each individual piece is relatively small, but you can get them coordinated with each other in such a way to make them useful, then yeah, that counts.
Great. And then I'm wondering if you can speak to any of the benefits of a V2G system being in an air-conditioned space versus an outdoor.
Andrea, you want to take that one?
Energy storage, yeah.
Sure, huge. So the example I showed for the September 4CP event, it was only the car, and the reason why it was only the car, it was because it was in an air-conditioned space. So for those of you in Texas, an afternoon in September is well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And we actually had to put in place some limitations on the stationary batteries, which are installed outside, because they were getting too hot just from sitting there, not even from charging or discharging, running cycles. They were just getting extremely hot to the point that we, if they passed 38 degrees centigrade, which is about, 90, pardon me, my fast math, but about 90 degrees, we shut them off for safety. And so we didn't have to do that with the car being in an air-conditioned space. So that was why The car was the only energy storage system, the only asset that was actually able to provide value during that one day, in that one event, which is very, very.
And I would add that I'm not 100% necessary that it needs to be full air conditioning, but it does need to at least be a shaded space. We had batteries that were installed, but some of the fixed batteries that were installed in a location that was shaded by trees and bushes and things, and then people trimmed the trees and bushes. And then, so one summer they were fine, and the next summer at about 4 o'clock, the angle of the sun came in such that they had direct sunlight on them, right? And things like that. I've actually talked to some sort of green building organizations about planning for these kinds of things in the future, whether or not it's electric vehicles or stationary storage, about having the electrical infrastructure and the physical infrastructure in place that's appropriate for those technologies. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be a little utility room or closet for like a water heater. It just needs to be something that has a built-in shade structure to shade an outdoor battery, right? Or something like that.
Great. So next question. What is the future of vehicle battery interaction with home PV systems, as well as other loads such as AC, water heating, or refrigerators?
That's a great question. That falls under home energy management. And I think that this is something that we've been looking at for a very long time. There is a couple of things that are still holding this up. One is standardization of communications between these devices. And then the other is again, a whole nother webinar, so we'll have to write this down so we can do one on this too. It's the interaction and communication between devices, but then there's also that regulatory piece that we were that I sort of punted on earlier, right? I have to do it again because there's limited ways to participate in the marketplace, and if you can get something aggregated and large enough and guaranteed and measurable and verifiable and all of these things that you need, then you can play in the marketplace. And I think that there is a lot of opportunity, especially once the home starts to have some storage.
Great. And another somewhat related question. Do you know if the smart inverter can have a dual input, meaning from solar and from the vehicle?
Yes, actually it can.
Okay.
In fact, the Princeton Power System has that, but we, as part of the program, we only looked at the vehicle connection. There are multiple products that have that.
Great. And then a question about compensation policy. And
Well, that's a whole nother webinar. Go ahead. We'll see if it's a simple one.
Knowing that this might, vary between states and even between utilities, is there a process for getting credited for reducing peak demand or for sending energy back to the grid?
That varies so wildly. I mean, there's in places where there's strong time of use pricing. There's no direct payment right now that I know of in the Texas marketplace to a end consumer. What it boils down to is that their overall sort of connection fees and usage rates and rate cases end up dropping. I don't know of anybody that gets paid directly for a 4CP reduction. Do you, Andrea?
No, that is all in the, so
yeah, it's all in the rate case. So
Boston Energy, they're vertically integrated. So whatever reduction they can get on the transmission, it's gonna, quote unquote, pass on to the customer.
Right.
But that's very unique to Austin and San Antonio in Texas, and then every other city in Texas has a completely different economic model for that. So I don't think, yeah.
I mean, there's when I go to these conferences, there's actually folks that are sort of rate case specialists, and they often have regions that they specialize in, because it's impossible to be a rate case specialist for the entirety of the United States.
Yeah. But I think to Scott's point, probably places that do have time of use is probably the best place for this type of technology.
I would even make
an aggregator, you know, that really is bringing value. You know,
I would even argue that that you can make a case for that to bring it back to that home energy monitoring system. Even if it wasn't vehicle to grid, even if there was a good integration between solar and a regular level 1 or level 2 EVSE to the car, then you could use the car as sort of a buffer in places where you need to do no net export, like Hawaii or places in Vermont and Arizona, right? So, but I don't know of anybody that's actually doing that link. We have some test devices that we've developed that can do that. That is eventually going to be another webinar topic, but we have devices where we can control that charge rate based on some signal. And as Andrea showed, it reacts very quickly. You can actually do things like frequency regulation with cars. But that is a very complicated and complex topic.
Great. So another question, are there issues with the utility interconnection process with an onboard inverter on a vehicle that's, you know, traveling around using several charging points instead of a static inverter in the charger?
Well, there's, so like the way it's done right now is the electronics are in that vehicle, and it's just the charger, quote unquote, is a switch, right? Unless it's the vehicle to grid that we had. Then once you have the vehicle to grid, it depends on the size and the utility, right? That interconnection agreement varies wildly. California's are pretty complex with Rule 21 and all that stuff. This is now, distributed energy resource versus, Texas, which is fairly simple. So the answer is it depends. But right now, it basically the total resource and the individual size is small enough where it's basically ends up being less of an interconnection agreement, but more of a permitting issue with, does the building have enough ampacity in the size? Does the panel have enough ampacity? Do you have to upgrade any of that stuff? Do you have to run a separate circuit? Those kinds of things.
Great. And then another question, if you were to replace your stationary battery for a vehicle to grid system, one, would that be feasible or would that be a reasonable decision to make? And two, would there be any kind of opportunity to reuse that stationary battery for another application?
I mean, you can always reuse the batteries. You can always move them and reinstall them. I think I honestly, until recently, I would have said that the batteries in the vehicles will probably be the primary energy storage in a home, but the costs for fixed energy storage keep dropping so fast that I'm really not sure. Like, I don't know. It's starting to become I've always talked about this when I give presentations at panels. People didn't understand how fast solar was going to be adopted because they kept applying adoption rates of sort of industrial equipment and cost curves of sort of industrial equipment, when in reality we needed to apply the cost curves of consumer electronics to them. And all of a sudden residential energy storage is starting to get onto that consumer electronics cost curve. And so, we're seeing announcements from Enphase and LG and Tesla and other folks, and the prices just keep coming down.
Great. So I think in the interest of time, we'll wrap up questions there. I think we got to most of them, but if we didn't, feel free to email us and we're happy to get back to you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Colin to wrap it up.
All right, and we're also, just for folks who might have joined in the middle, we are going to post a video of this webinar so that you can watch it after the fact, or if you thought it was so good you want to watch it twice, you can watch it on Friday night. You're welcome. So I just wanted to wrap up and remind everyone here are the contact information for Andrea and Scott. If you want to make sure that you're on our webinar list, please email us at media@Pecan Street. If you want to get a hold of the V2G case study that Andrea worked on, you can scan the QR code or go to that final URL there. If you have any general questions, Clayton and I will take those at media@Pecan Street. We'll make sure that the right person at Pecan Street gets your question, and we'll get some answers back to you. And with that, I will close for the afternoon. I want to thank all of you for joining us. For Scott and Andrea, Clayton, thank you for helping out. Everyone have
Thank
a
you.
safe, healthy, and a restful weekend. So goodbye for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.